On the morning of the 7th day of August in 1942, the horizon over the Solomon Islands began to lighten with the first traces of dawn. The tropical darkness that had concealed the massive Allied fleet throughout the night started to give way to grey light, revealing an armada unlike anything these waters had seen before. 75 warships and transports, carrying 11,000 United States Marines, prepared to launch the first major American offensive operation against the Empire of Japan. The men who would storm ashore at Guadalcanal that morning carried with them not just weapons and equipment, but the weight of a nation's hopes after months of defeats and retreats across the Pacific. The operation bore the code name Watchtower, though the Marines who would fight there came to know it by a darker designation. Some called it Operation Shoestring, a reflection of the hasty planning and limited resources that characterized the enterprise. The invasion had been conceived, planned, and executed in barely 2 months, a timeline that left commanders anxious about logistics, intelligence, and the 1,000 details that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Yet for all the concerns about supplies and support, no one could have predicted that one of the most effective weapons to emerge from the campaign would be rooted not in American industrial might or technological superiority, but in the fundamental architecture of human speech itself. The landing commenced at 0910 hours on that August morning. Marines of the 1st Marine Division poured from landing craft onto beaches that, to their surprise and relief, met them with no resistance. The Japanese garrison, caught completely off guard by the assault, had withdrawn into the interior of the island. This initial ease proved deceptive. The real struggle for Guadalcanal would unfold not in the first hours, but over the brutal months that followed, as Japanese forces mounted increasingly desperate attempts to retake what they had lost. Within hours of the landing, Marine patrols discovered their primary objective. Nearly complete and operational, a Japanese airfield lay just inland from the beaches. The construction was sophisticated, the runway almost ready for use. Japanese engineers had selected the site with care, recognizing that control of this airfield would dominate the surrounding seas and islands. For the Marines, capturing this installation intact represented an extraordinary stroke of fortune. For the Japanese High Command, losing it would prove intolerable, guaranteeing that they would commit enormous resources to its recapture. The airstrip, which the Japanese had designated Lunga Airfield after a nearby point, was renamed Henderson Field by the Americans. The new name honored Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator who had died just 2 months earlier during the Battle of Midway, leading his squadron in a desperate attack against Japanese carriers. Henderson had pressed his attack despite heavy anti-aircraft fire, and his courage symbolized the determination the Marines would need for the months ahead. The airfield that now bore his name would become the focal point of the entire campaign, the objective around which 6 months of savage combat would revolve. But securing the airfield was only the beginning of the challenge facing the Marines on Guadalcanal. The island itself presented an environment alien and hostile to the American forces. Dense tropical jungle covered much of the terrain, with vegetation so thick that visibility sometimes dropped to mere feet. The heat was oppressive, a constant wet heat that sapped strength and made every movement an effort. Rain fell frequently, turning trails to mud and making rest impossible. At night, the jungle came alive with sounds that kept exhausted men on edge, every rustle and crack potentially signaling enemy movement. The Japanese response to the American landing was swift and massive. Within days, enemy warships began arriving in the waters around Guadalcanal, bringing reinforcements and supplies. Japanese aircraft from bases to the north commenced regular bombing raids against Henderson Field and the Marine positions. Most critically, Japanese ground forces began landing on the island, preparing to mount counterattacks aimed at driving the Americans back into the sea. The struggle for Guadalcanal evolved into a grinding attritional battle, with both sides pouring in reinforcements and neither willing to concede defeat. In this environment of continuous combat operations, the Marines confronted a security challenge that proved as dangerous as direct combat. Japanese forces, trained in infiltration tactics and skilled at moving through jungle terrain, began attempting to penetrate the American defensive perimeter under cover of darkness. These infiltration attempts took various forms. Sometimes small groups of Japanese soldiers would try to slip through the lines to gather intelligence about American positions and strength. Other times, individual infiltrators would attempt to move deep into American-held territory to conduct sabotage, targeting ammunition dumps, fuel stores, or parked aircraft. On some occasions, Japanese forces attempted to impersonate American personnel, using captured uniforms and equipment to deceive sentries and gain access to restricted areas. The threat was real and persistent. Night after night, sentries posted along the defensive perimeter had to make split-second decisions about whether approaching figures in the darkness were friendly Marines returning from patrol or Japanese infiltrators seeking to breach the lines. The consequences of error ran in both directions. Failing to challenge and stop an infiltrator could result in intelligence compromise, sabotage, or misdirection of American forces. But incorrectly identifying a friendly Marine as an enemy could result in tragic friendly fire incidents. The sentries needed a reliable method of identification that would work in darkness, under stress, and in conditions where traditional verification methods proved inadequate. Standard military identification procedures, developed and refined over centuries of warfare, suddenly seemed insufficient in the jungles of Guadalcanal. Written documents could be captured from casualties or prisoners, then carried by infiltrators attempting to pass as legitimate personnel. Uniforms, while theoretically distinctive, became difficult to identify in darkness, and Japanese forces had demonstrated their willingness to use captured American uniforms when such deception served their purposes. Physical appearance offered little help when sentries could barely see beyond a few feet in the jungle darkness. Even voices could deceive, as the Marines soon discovered that some Japanese soldiers spoke English with varying degrees of fluency, having studied the language in school or during time spent in English-speaking countries before the war. The solution that emerged demonstrated both practical ingenuity and an intuitive understanding of linguistic fundamentals. Marines began systematically using passwords that incorporated sounds Japanese speakers found exceptionally difficult to pronounce correctly. The most effective of these passwords centered on words containing the English letter L, a sound that Japanese speakers struggled to produce in a way that native English speakers would recognize as correct. This approach proved remarkably effective, providing sentries with a quick, reliable method of identifying infiltrators that required no equipment, no documentation, and no special training beyond the ability to recognize correct English pronunciation. The primary testimony about this practice comes from Master Technical Sergeant James Hurlbut, a combat correspondent with the United States Marine Corps Reserve, who landed with the assault forces on August 7th. Hurlbut spent months on Guadalcanal, observing and documenting the campaign as it unfolded. On March 10, 1943, several months after the conclusion of the Guadalcanal campaign, he sat for an interview that was preserved in naval records. His testimony provides the clearest primary source evidence we possess about the systematic use of pronunciation testing during the campaign. Speaking with the directness of a man recounting practical matters rather than dramatic stories, Hurlbut explained the reasoning behind the password selection. "We always had passwords including the letter L," he stated, because L was thought to be hard for the Japanese to pronounce since there is no L in the Japanese vocabulary. This simple observation, delivered without embellishment, captured a sophisticated understanding of linguistic limitations. The Marines had recognized, whether through conscious linguistic knowledge or practical observation, that the Japanese language lacked a sound equivalent to the English L, and that this absence created a vulnerability that could be exploited for security purposes. Hurlbut also noted an important limitation that revealed the real-world complexity of applying pronunciation testing. The test sometimes failed with English-educated Japanese soldiers, he observed. This acknowledgement demonstrated that Marines were encountering infiltrators with varying levels of English proficiency, and that the measure, while generally effective, was not an infallible solution. Japanese individuals who had spent significant time in English-speaking environments, particularly during childhood, might have acquired pronunciation patterns close enough to native English to pass the test. This limitation meant that pronunciation testing had to be used as part of a broader security framework rather than as a sole method of identification. To understand why pronunciation testing based on L sounds proved so effective against most Japanese speakers, we must examine the fundamental differences between Japanese and English phonological systems. These differences are not superficial matters of accent or preference, but reflect deep structural characteristics of how these languages organize and process sounds. The human brain, particularly during early childhood, develops specialized neural pathways for perceiving and producing the sounds of the native language. These pathways become highly efficient for the native language, but create perceptual boundaries that make learning certain sounds in other languages extraordinarily difficult for adults. Japanese possesses one liquid phoneme, a sound that falls into the general category of liquids along with L and R sounds in other languages. In standard Hepburn romanization, the system most commonly used for writing Japanese in Latin letters, this sound is represented by the letter R. However, the Japanese R sound is pronounced quite differently from either the English R or the English L sound. Linguistically, this Japanese liquid is classified as an apico-alveolar tap or flap, represented in the International Phonetic Alphabet with the symbol that looks like a small capital R or a turned R. Native Japanese speakers produce this sound through a quick, light contact between the tongue tip and the alveolar ridge, the area of the roof of the mouth just behind the upper front teeth. The tongue strikes the alveolar ridge briefly and bounces away, creating a sound that native English speakers might perceive as somewhere between an English R, L, and D sound. English, in contrast, possesses two completely distinct liquid phonemes that native speakers perceive as entirely different sounds. The English L sound is classified as a lateral approximant, a term that describes how the sound is produced. The speaker places the tongue tip firmly against the alveolar ridge, creating a seal in the center of the mouth, while allowing air to flow around the sides of the tongue. This lateral airflow gives the sound its characteristic quality. The tongue maintains contact with the alveolar ridge throughout the production of the sound, and the sound can be sustained for as long as the speaker continues to exhale. The American English R sound operates on completely different principles. It is typically produced as a post-alveolar approximant, meaning the tongue is positioned near the post-alveolar region, but does not make contact with the roof of the mouth. The tongue bunches up and pulls back, with the sides of the tongue touching the upper molars, while the center of the tongue rises toward the palate without making contact. The lips may round slightly, and the entire configuration creates a sound acoustically and articulatorily distinct from the L sound. These two English sounds occupy distinctly different positions in the phonetic space, separated by multiple articulatory dimensions. For native English speakers, the difference between L and R is so obvious and automatic that distinguishing them requires no conscious effort or thought. A native English speaker can instantly and accurately identify whether a word contains an L or R sound, even in noisy conditions or when spoken by unfamiliar voices. This ability feels effortless because it reflects neural pathways established during the first years of life, when the developing brain created perceptual categories specifically tuned to the phonetic structure of English. For native Japanese speakers, however, both the English L and English R sounds fall within a single perceptual category, the category defined by the Japanese liquid phoneme. The Japanese brain, having organized its phonetic perception around the five-vowel simple consonant structure of Japanese, processes both English sounds as variants of the single Japanese liquid. This perceptual organization is not a matter of physical inability or hearing impairment. Japanese speakers can physically produce both English sounds with proper training, and they can hear the acoustic differences between the sounds when they are presented in carefully controlled conditions. The difficulty is perceptual and categorical. When Japanese speakers hear English L and R sounds in the continuous stream of natural speech, their brains automatically categorize both sounds as instances of the single Japanese liquid phoneme, just as native English speakers might fail to distinguish between phonetically distinct variants of a single English phoneme. Research conducted during and after the war confirmed and elaborated on this phenomenon, providing scientific validation for what the Marines on Guadalcanal had discovered through practical observation. In 1971, researcher Hiromu Goto published a study demonstrating that Japanese speakers struggled to perceive the English R and L distinction even after extended exposure to English. In 1975, Miyawaki and colleagues conducted experiments that revealed something particularly relevant to the wartime application of pronunciation testing. They found that when researchers manipulated recordings of R and L sounds to make them sound less speech-like, removing certain acoustic information that typically characterizes human speech, Japanese speakers could distinguish them as well as native English speakers. This proved that the difficulty was not in hearing the acoustic differences themselves, but in how the brain processed those differences when they appeared in the context of language. The implications of this research for understanding the effectiveness of pronunciation testing during the war are significant. The findings demonstrated that Japanese speakers' difficulty with English L and R sounds stemmed from fundamental aspects of how the brain processes speech sounds, not from lack of exposure, insufficient training, or inadequate motivation. The perceptual categories for speech sounds are established early in childhood, during a critical period when the brain is extraordinarily plastic and capable of learning any human language with native proficiency. After this critical period closes, typically sometime before puberty, acquiring native-like pronunciation in a second language becomes progressively more difficult. The neural pathways for perceiving and producing speech sounds in the native language become increasingly entrenched and resistant to modification. For military security purposes, this linguistic reality meant that Japanese soldiers attempting infiltration faced a nearly insurmountable obstacle when challenged with L-based passwords. Even soldiers who had studied English extensively, who might possess substantial vocabulary and grammatical knowledge, who could maintain conversations in English, would betray themselves through pronunciation of words containing L sounds. The pronunciation pattern was not under conscious control in the way that word choice or grammatical construction might be. Under stress, fatigue, or time pressure, automatic native language pronunciation patterns would emerge regardless of the infiltrator's intentions, training, or preparation. A Japanese soldier approaching an American sentry at night, knowing that his life depended on correct pronunciation of a password, would still find himself physically unable to produce the English L sound in the way a native English speaker would. The Marines implemented this knowledge through systematic selection of passwords that incorporated multiple L sounds. According to Hurlbut's testimony and the limited documentation available, passwords were specifically chosen to include the letter L, and sentries were trained to listen carefully to how the passwords were pronounced. When a sentry challenged an approaching figure with a password containing L sounds, a native English speaker would pronounce it automatically and correctly, without thought or effort. A Japanese speaker, even one with substantial English training, would either substitute the Japanese liquid sound, producing something that sounded like an R to English speakers, or would attempt an L sound that nevertheless carried the articulatory and acoustic characteristics of a non-native production. One specific word has entered the historical record through a single source, though we must be precise about the strength of evidence supporting its actual use. Oliver Gramling, a journalist with the Associated Press, published a book titled Free Men Are Fighting in 1942 with the publisher Farrar and Reinhardt. The book appeared while the war was still in progress, making it a contemporary source rather than a later memoir or history. On page 315 of this work, Gramling described Japanese soldiers sometimes approaching checkpoints while posing as American or Filipino military personnel. He stated that sentries would use what he called a shibboleth, such as Lollapalooza, and if the first two syllables came back as Rora, the sentry would open fire without waiting to hear the remainder of the word. The word Lollapalooza represents an ideal choice for pronunciation testing purposes if it was indeed used during the campaign. An American slang term meaning something outstanding or extraordinary, the word contains 4 L sounds in rapid succession at the beginning of syllables. The phonetic structure goes lo-la-pa-loo-za, with each L sound presenting difficulty for a Japanese speaker. The concentration of L sounds in the first portion of the word makes it virtually impossible for someone with Japanese phonological patterns to pronounce correctly without extensive, specialized training focused specifically on this type of sound. The instruction to listen specifically to the first 2 syllables makes tactical sense as well. A sentry would not need to wait for the complete password to identify mispronunciation, reducing the time of exposure during the challenge and allowing faster response to identified threats. However, historical rigor demands that we acknowledge the limitations of the evidence for this specific word. Gramling's book is the only known source that mentions Lollapalooza in connection with pronunciation testing at Guadalcanal. While Gramling was a credible journalist with access to military sources, and while his book was published during the war when memories were fresh and fact-checking against participants was possible, no independent corroboration appears in official Marine Corps after-action reports, operational histories, unit diaries, or other memoirs from participants in the campaign. Richard Tregaskis, who served as a war correspondent on Guadalcanal and published his widely read Guadalcanal Diary in 1943 based on his personal experiences on the island, does not mention the specific word Lollapalooza in his account, though he does describe many aspects of security procedures and daily life on the island. What we can state with certainty, based on Hurlburt's direct testimony in an official interview, is that L-based passwords were systematically used during the Guadalcanal campaign. Whether Lollapalooza was specifically one of those passwords remains plausible, but not definitively proven. The word fits the tactical requirements perfectly, appears in a contemporary source written by a credible journalist, and aligns precisely with the documented practice of using L-based passwords. But additional corroboration from official military documents or other participant accounts would strengthen the claim from plausible to certain. This distinction matters for historical accuracy, even though the core story of pronunciation testing remains firmly established regardless of which specific words were used. The Guadalcanal campaign extended across 6 months, from the initial landing on August 7, 1942, until February 9, 1943, when Japanese forces successfully evacuated their remaining troops from the island in a skillfully executed withdrawal operation. During these 6 months, the Marines and later Army forces who reinforced them faced constant pressure from Japanese attempts to retake Henderson Field and drive the Americans off the island. The campaign featured numerous major battles and countless smaller engagements. On August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru River saw Japanese forces launch a frontal assault across the river, resulting in heavy Japanese casualties. From September 12th through 14th, the Battle of Edson's Ridge saw Japanese forces nearly break through the Marine defensive perimeter in fighting so intense that the ridge was renamed Bloody Ridge after the engagement. From October 23rd through 26th, the battle for Henderson Field saw the most determined Japanese effort to recapture the airfield, with coordinated land, sea, and air attacks that came closer to success than any other Japanese offensive during the campaign. Throughout these major engagements and during the periods between them, security around the American perimeter remained absolutely critical. The defensive perimeter, roughly elliptical in shape and extending several miles in each direction from Henderson Field, had to be maintained 24 hours a day against infiltration attempts. At night, sentries were posted at intervals around the perimeter and at checkpoints along the trails that led into American-held territory. These sentries faced an extraordinarily difficult task. Working in darkness so complete that they often could not see their own hands in front of their faces, exhausted from days or weeks of sustained combat operations and inadequate sleep, poorly supplied with the equipment and support they needed, they nevertheless had to maintain constant vigilance against infiltration. Japanese infiltration tactics were sophisticated and varied. Japanese soldiers, operating individually or in small groups, would attempt to penetrate American lines through several methods. Some moved with extraordinary stealth, taking advantage of detailed knowledge of terrain they had studied before the American invasion. They employed excellent camouflage, attaching jungle vegetation to their uniforms and moving at a pace so slow that their movement barely disturbed the surrounding foliage. Other infiltrators moved more quickly, but waited for moments when American attention was diverted by artillery fire, air raids, or combat elsewhere along the perimeter. Some attempted to approach American positions by following natural terrain features like stream beds or ridgelines that provided concealment. A few, most daringly, attempted to impersonate American personnel, either by wearing captured uniforms or by approaching openly and claiming to be Marines returning from patrol. The threat was real, persistent, and documented in numerous after-action reports and personal accounts from the campaign. Sentries who failed to detect infiltrators might find themselves bypassed, with enemy forces operating behind American lines gathering intelligence about positions and strength, targeting command posts or supply dumps for attack, or preparing to guide larger assault forces through gaps in the defensive perimeter. The consequences of infiltration could be severe, ranging from loss of supplies and equipment to compromise of operational plans to friendly casualties from attacks that struck where defenders were unprepared. In this context, pronunciation testing provided a reliable method for identifying infiltrators that did not depend on visual confirmation, proper documentation, or extended conversation. A simple challenge with a password containing L sounds could expose an infiltrator in seconds. The test worked precisely because it exploited something the infiltrator could not easily control or fake: the automatic pronunciation patterns established during childhood language acquisition and maintained through decades of speaking Japanese. An infiltrator might have memorized the password, might have practiced pronunciation, might have prepared every aspect of his cover story, but when challenged suddenly in darkness after hours of moving through hostile territory, the automatic phonological patterns of his native language would likely emerge, betraying his identity to a trained sentry. Hurlbut's interview also revealed an interesting additional security indicator that speaks to the multi-layered nature of identification during the campaign. On at least one occasion, a sentry detected Japanese infiltrators not through pronunciation, but through grammar that was much too precise for the average Marine. One infiltrator reportedly approached and said in carefully correct English, something like, "Hold your fire, we are American Marines and wish to report our evening's activities." The sentry, rather than being reassured by this formally correct English, immediately recognized it as suspicious and opened fire. As Hurlbut explained, the sentry knew that no Marine would talk that way. Real Marines, exhausted and moving through jungle at night, would use colloquial, informal language, probably punctuated with profanity, certainly not the careful, textbook-correct constructions that a Japanese soldier who had studied English in school might produce. This anecdote reveals an important aspect of how language works as an identifier beyond simple pronunciation. Native speakers of any language develop an intuitive sense not just of how to pronounce words correctly, but of which grammatical constructions sound natural in which contexts, what level of formality is appropriate for different situations, and what kinds of variations and even errors are typical of native speech. A Japanese soldier who had studied English formally might know correct grammar better than many native English speakers, but this very correctness could become suspicious when it appeared in contexts where native speakers would naturally use more casual, informal, or even technically incorrect constructions. The term shibboleth, which has come to describe pronunciation-based identification tests like those used at Guadalcanal, derives from the Hebrew Bible. The story appears in the Book of Judges, verses 5 and 6. The Gileadites, having defeated the Ephraimites in battle, needed to identify enemy survivors attempting to escape across the Jordan River. Knowing that Ephraimites spoke a dialect that lacked a particular sound found in the Gileadite dialect, they challenged each person attempting to cross by asking them to say the word shibboleth. The Ephraimites, lacking the sound in their dialect, would pronounce it as sibboleth, revealing their identity. According to the biblical account, 42,000 Ephraimites were identified and killed through this pronunciation test, a grim testament to the effectiveness of exploiting linguistic differences for identification purposes. Similar linguistic tests have appeared throughout military history whenever forces needed to distinguish friend from foe, and language differences provided a reliable marker. During the Sicilian Vespers in 1282, French soldiers occupying Sicily were identified by their inability to correctly pronounce the Sicilian word "ciciri," chickpeas. During the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule in the 16th century, the phrase "schild on vriend," shield and friend, was used to identify Spanish soldiers who struggled with the initial consonant cluster. During the Haitian Revolution, the word parsley served to identify Haitians versus French speakers, as the French pronunciation of the word differed distinctly from the Haitian Creole pronunciation. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, used a different linguistic principle for similar purposes. The challenge and password system employed flash as the challenge, thunder as the password, and welcome as the countersign. These words were chosen specifically because they contained sounds that German speakers found difficult. The voiceless dental fricative, the th sound in thunder, does not exist in German phonology, and German speakers typically substitute either a T or an S sound when attempting to produce it. The voiced labial velar approximant, the W sound in welcome, is also absent from standard German phonology, with German speakers typically substituting a V sound. This parallel use of linguistic shibboleths in the European theatre demonstrates that military forces across different theatres of World War II recognized the value of exploiting phonological differences for security purposes. Beyond the L and R distinction, several other English phonetic features presented difficulty for Japanese speakers, any of which could theoretically have been exploited for pronunciation testing. The English th sound, produced by bringing the upper teeth into light contact with the lower lip while voicing, does not exist in Japanese and is typically pronounced by Japanese speakers as a B sound, produced by bringing the two lips together. The English th sounds, both the voiceless fricative as in think and the voiced fricative as in this, are absent from Japanese, with speakers typically substituting S or Z sounds. The English vowel system, which contains many more distinct vowels than Japanese, presents substantial challenges for Japanese speakers, who must learn to distinguish vowel contrasts that do not exist in their native language. Security-conscious password selection could exploit any of these phonological differences, though the L versus R distinction appears to have been the most commonly used based on Hurlbut's testimony and the limited available documentation. The L sound may have been preferred because it was easy for sentries to detect, appeared frequently in English words, allowing wide choice of passwords, and represented such a clear case of phonological difference that even minimally trained sentries could reliably detect non-native pronunciation. The relative frequency of L sounds in common English words also meant that passwords could be changed regularly without difficulty finding suitable new words. The broader context of security measures in the Pacific Theater provides additional perspective on pronunciation testing. American forces throughout the Pacific, from the first desperate defensive battles in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies through the island-hopping campaigns that followed Guadalcanal, faced persistent challenges with infiltration, deception, and the difficulty of distinguishing friend from foe in conditions where visual identification was often impossible. The challenge and password system used by military forces worldwide became even more critical in the Pacific due to several factors unique to that theater. First, the jungle environment of most Pacific battlefields reduced visibility dramatically compared to the more open terrain of the European theater or North African campaigns. Dense vegetation, heavy rainfall, and the frequent use of nighttime operations by Japanese forces meant that sentries often had to make identification decisions based solely on sound and verbal communication without visual confirmation. Second, Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized infiltration, night operations, and attacks that sought to create maximum confusion and chaos among defending forces. Japanese forces had trained extensively in these tactics before the war and executed them with skill and determination throughout the Pacific campaigns. Third, Japanese forces occasionally captured American equipment, uniforms, and supplies, creating the possibility that infiltrators might possess authentic American materials that would normally serve as identification. The challenge and password system itself has ancient origins in military practice. In principle, it operates simply. A sentry issues a challenge, typically a single word. The person being challenged must respond with the correct password, another predetermined word that changes regularly and is distributed only to friendly forces. If the password is wrong or not given, the sentry takes appropriate action, which might range from detaining the person for further investigation to immediately opening fire, depending on the tactical situation and standing orders. The effectiveness of this system depends on several factors. The challenge and password must be changed regularly to prevent compromise if enemy forces capture friendly personnel or documents. They must be distributed securely to all friendly forces while being kept from enemy knowledge. And ideally, they should be chosen to make correct production by enemy forces difficult even if the password becomes known. This last consideration, choosing passwords that exploit linguistic differences, represents a sophisticated refinement of the basic challenge and password system. Rather than relying solely on keeping the password secret, which becomes progressively more difficult as more personnel need to know it, and as the duration of use increases the chances of compromise, linguistic shibboleths add an additional layer of security. Even if an infiltrator somehow learned that the password was Lollapalooza, actually pronouncing it correctly would remain extraordinarily difficult without native English phonological patterns or extensive specialized training. The Military Intelligence Service Language School provides an interesting counterpoint and addition to the pronunciation testing story. Established on November 1, 1941, just over a month before the Pearl Harbor attack at the Presidio of San Francisco, the school was created to train personnel in Japanese language for military intelligence purposes. Following Executive Order 9066, which led to the internment of Japanese Americans from West Coast areas, the school moved to Camp Savage, Minnesota in June 1942. It later relocated again to Fort Snelling, Minnesota in August 1944, operating there until June 1946. Throughout its existence, the school trained over 6,000 Japanese American soldiers, primarily Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, as translators, interpreters, and intelligence specialists. These Japanese American linguists served throughout the Pacific Theater in every major campaign. They provided critical language support that proved invaluable to Allied success. They interrogated prisoners of war, extracting tactical and strategic intelligence. They translated captured documents, including operational plans, unit diaries, personal letters, and technical manuals. They intercepted and translated radio communications, providing real-time intelligence about Japanese movements and intentions. They provided cultural insights that helped American commanders understand Japanese military thinking, tactical preferences, and likely courses of action. Their contribution was essential to Allied success and was achieved despite the fact that many of their families were confined in internment camps while they fought for the United States. For pronunciation testing purposes, these Japanese American soldiers would have automatically passed any L-based challenge without difficulty. Having acquired English during childhood in American communities, growing up speaking English as their primary or co-primary language, they possessed native English phonological patterns. Their pronunciation of L sounds would be indistinguishable from that of any other native English speaker. Their presence in the Pacific Theater, while invaluable for intelligence work, also meant that security forces needed to be aware that Japanese ethnicity did not automatically indicate enemy status. The pronunciation tests, properly understood and implemented, identified linguistic background rather than ethnicity, Japanese citizenship, and Japanese language background rather than Japanese ancestry. The implications of this distinction are significant both practically and ethically. Pronunciation testing, as implemented at Guadalcanal, was fundamentally a measure of language background, specifically whether someone had acquired English phonological patterns during childhood, or had learned English as a second language after the critical period for native pronunciation had closed. The test correlated with enemy status because Japanese soldiers, having grown up in Japan speaking Japanese, would fail the test, while American Marines, having grown up in the United States speaking English, would pass it. Japanese Americans serving with American forces would also pass the test, demonstrating that the measure identified linguistic identity rather than ethnic identity. This understanding helps explain why pronunciation testing remained an acceptable security measure within the framework of the laws of war and military necessity, despite being implemented during a war in which racial prejudice against Japanese people was widespread and explicit. The test did not identify people based on race or ethnicity, but based on an objective characteristic, native language background, that correlated strongly with national origin and therefore military allegiance. A Japanese American like those serving with the Military Intelligence Service could prove his American identity through pronunciation just as effectively as any other American soldier. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, though he did not serve at Guadalcanal during the actual campaign, provides valuable perspective on the Pacific War from the viewpoint of an enlisted Marine. Sledge enlisted in the Marine Corps and served with K Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division. He participated in two of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War, the assaults on Peleliu and Okinawa, experiencing combat conditions that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. His memoir, With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa, published in 1981, decades after the war, became recognized as one of the finest first-person accounts of infantry combat ever written. Historians and military professionals praise the book for its unflinching honesty about the physical and psychological realities of sustained combat. While Sledge's memoir does not specifically discuss pronunciation testing, as his combat experience came in later campaigns after security procedures had become routine and unremarkable, his account provides invaluable context for understanding the conditions under which such measures operated. He describes the constant exhaustion that characterized life in combat, the way sleep deprivation accumulated until men could barely think clearly. He details the environmental challenges, the heat, rain, mud, and insects that added misery to danger. He explains the psychological toll of sustained combat, the way constant exposure to death and violence affected men's thinking and behavior. In this context, security measures like pronunciation testing had to be simple enough to implement reliably despite exhaustion, stress, and fear, while still providing reasonably accurate identification. The 6-month Guadalcanal campaign exacted an enormous cost from both sides. American forces suffered approximately 7,100 killed in action and over 8,000 wounded. These numbers included losses from ground combat, naval battles around the island, and air operations. Disease also took a heavy toll, with malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases affecting thousands of men and requiring evacuation of many from the island. Japanese casualties were substantially higher. Estimates suggest approximately 31,000 Japanese soldiers died during the campaign, many not from combat but from disease and starvation, as American naval and air forces increasingly interdicted Japanese supply efforts. By the final weeks of the campaign, Japanese forces on the island were receiving minimal supplies, and soldiers were subsisting on rapidly dwindling rations while fighting disease and maintaining combat operations. The successful Japanese evacuation in early February 1943, conducted over several nights using fast destroyers to lift approximately 10,000 surviving troops off the island, saved these soldiers for deployment elsewhere, but could not disguise the strategic defeat Japan had suffered. Japan had lost the initiative in the Pacific. The offensive momentum that had carried Japanese forces across vast areas in the war's first months had been halted and then reversed. Henderson Field remained in American hands, providing an air base that dominated the surrounding area and supported subsequent Allied advances up the Solomon Islands chain toward the major Japanese base at Rabaul. Throughout the campaign, as the major battles were fought and won, security around the American perimeter continued to require constant vigilance. The pronunciation testing that had been implemented early in the campaign remained a standard security measure. Its effectiveness, while not perfect, provided sentries with a tool that worked more reliably than available alternatives. The limitations of the approach, particularly the fact that it sometimes failed with English-educated Japanese soldiers, as Hurlbut noted, meant that it had to be used as part of a comprehensive security framework rather than as a sole identification method. Additionally, in the chaos of actual combat, with artillery fire, explosions, small arms fire, and shouting, subtle pronunciation differences might be difficult to detect reliably. A sentry trying to hear how someone pronounced an L sound while explosions were occurring nearby and tracers were cutting through the jungle might not be able to make accurate judgments. Environmental noise, acoustic interference, and the stress of combat all degraded the effectiveness of any auditory identification method. This limitation meant that pronunciation testing worked best in relatively quiet conditions, at checkpoints removed from immediate combat rather than during actual fighting. The test also carried potential risks of false identification. American forces in the Pacific included soldiers from diverse backgrounds. Filipino scouts and soldiers, who served with distinction throughout the Pacific War, spoke English with accents that reflected their native Tagalog, Cebuano, or other Philippine languages. Chinese Americans serving in American forces might have English pronunciation influenced by Chinese. Other ethnic groups represented in American forces might have non-standard English pronunciation patterns. Security procedures needed to account for legitimate variation in English pronunciation among Allied forces to avoid tragic friendly fire incidents. Fortunately, the phonological differences between Philippine languages and Japanese meant that Filipino English speakers typically had no difficulty with English L and R sounds. These phonemes exist distinctly in Tagalog and other Philippine languages, meaning that Filipino speakers who learned English would naturally be able to produce and distinguish these sounds. Their English might sound different from American pronunciation in other ways, perhaps in intonation patterns or vowel qualities, but the critical L versus R distinction would be clear. This linguistic reality meant that pronunciation testing based on L sounds could distinguish Japanese speakers from Filipino speakers as well as from American English speakers. Despite its limitations, pronunciation testing represented an elegant solution to a genuine security problem. It exploited real phonological differences that were not easily overcome or faked. It required no special equipment beyond the trained ear of a sentry. It could be administered quickly, in seconds rather than minutes. It provided a reasonable basis for identification when other methods were unavailable or unreliable. And critically, it worked because it accessed something fundamental about human language acquisition: the fact that phonological patterns established during early childhood remain remarkably stable throughout life and are extraordinarily difficult to modify, even with extensive training and conscious effort. The story of pronunciation testing at Guadalcanal serves multiple purposes for contemporary audiences. For historians, it provides insight into the practical details of security operations during the Pacific War, revealing how forces on the ground adapted to challenges and developed solutions using available resources and knowledge. For linguists, it illustrates real-world applications of phonological knowledge and demonstrates how understanding of language structure can have practical consequences beyond academic interest. For general audiences, it offers a fascinating example of how language itself can become a tool in warfare, how the seemingly abstract differences between how languages organize sounds can have concrete life and death implications in specific circumstances. But perhaps most importantly, the story reminds us to be careful and precise about historical claims, to distinguish between well-documented facts and later embellishments or elaborations. The verified core of the pronunciation testing story is clear and compelling. American forces at Guadalcanal systematically used passwords containing L sounds to help identify Japanese infiltrators who would struggle to pronounce those sounds correctly. This practice was documented by combat correspondent James Hurlbut in official testimony. The practice makes excellent sense given the well-understood phonological differences between Japanese and English. It represented practical innovation in response to genuine security challenges faced by forces operating in an extraordinarily difficult environment. The specific word Lollapalooza appears in one contemporary source, Oliver Gramling's 1942 book, and fits the documented pattern perfectly. The word contains multiple L sounds, would be extremely difficult for Japanese speakers to pronounce correctly, and represents the type of colourful American slang that would be natural for English-speaking Marines, but unlikely to be familiar to Japanese soldiers who had studied English formally. However, the lack of independent corroboration from other sources means we should categorize its use as plausible rather than proven, likely rather than certain. Beyond this verified core, many popular accounts have added details that cannot be confirmed from historical records. Claims about systematic Pacific-wide testing programs, elaborate procedures involving multiple verification steps, statistical success rates for identification, or attribution of the practice to specific named individuals other than Hurlbut cannot be verified from available documentation. These embellishments, while they might make for more dramatic storytelling, distort the historical record and create false impressions about the nature and extent of pronunciation testing. The honest history, based solely on verified evidence and reasonable inferences from that evidence, remains remarkable without embellishment. It shows American forces adapting intelligently to the challenges they faced, exploiting linguistic differences to improve security, innovating at the tactical level to address immediate threats. It demonstrates the value of observation, practical intelligence, and willingness to try new approaches in response to novel challenges. And it provides a window into the daily realities of combat operations in the Pacific Theater, where security, identification, and the constant threat of infiltration created persistent challenges for American forces operating in hostile, unfamiliar environments far from home. The Marines who developed and implemented pronunciation testing deserve recognition for their practical innovation and adaptability. They faced an environment that was simultaneously foreign and dangerous, fought an enemy that employed tactics unfamiliar to American military tradition, and found solutions using the resources and knowledge available to them. The broader context of the Guadalcanal campaign reminds us of the human cost of war, with thousands of men on both sides killed or wounded in a struggle for a small tropical island that most Americans had never heard of before August 1942. The Japanese-American linguists who served in the Pacific Theater, often while their families remained confined in internment camps, demonstrated extraordinary loyalty and professionalism under almost unbearably difficult circumstances. They served a country that had stripped their families of freedom and property based solely on ethnicity, yet they performed their duties with distinction and made essential contributions to Allied victory. Their story adds crucial depth and nuance to our understanding of the Pacific War, reminding us that even in a conflict marked by intense racial hatred on both sides, individual Americans of Japanese ancestry chose to serve their country despite having every reason to feel bitter or alienated. The pronunciation testing used at Guadalcanal represented one small element in the vast machinery of the Pacific War. One tactical innovation among thousands developed by forces on the ground facing specific challenges. Yet it illustrates important principles that extend beyond this particular campaign. The recognition that language differences could be systematically exploited for security purposes influenced subsequent military thinking about identification procedures. The understanding that phonological patterns are established early in childhood and remain stable throughout life has informed approaches to language training, accent analysis, and speaker identification in both military and civilian contexts. The post-war scientific research into language acquisition and phonology, conducted by linguists many of whom had served in military intelligence during the war, built on observations like those that made pronunciation testing effective. Researchers systematically investigated how infants acquire phonological categories, how these categories influence perception of speech sounds throughout life, and why adult second language learners find certain sounds difficult to master. This research revealed that humans are born with the capacity to distinguish phonetic contrasts from any human language, but that this universal capacity narrows during the first year of life as the brain specializes for the phonetic structure of the language being learned. By the end of the first year, infants have already begun to organize their perception around the phonetic categories of their native language, creating the foundation for the perceptual patterns that would make Japanese speakers struggle with English L versus R distinctions decades later. Understanding the neural and cognitive basis of pronunciation difficulties has practical implications that extend well beyond military applications. Language teachers can design more effective instruction by understanding which sounds will be difficult for speakers of particular native languages. Speech therapy can target specific phonetic difficulties more precisely. Forensic linguists can use pronunciation patterns to infer information about speakers' linguistic backgrounds. Automated speech recognition systems can be designed to handle accented speech more effectively by modeling how different native language backgrounds influence pronunciation patterns in the target language. The ethical dimensions of pronunciation testing, particularly in the context of World War II and its legacy, merit thoughtful consideration. Unlike some security measures that relied on deception, coercion, or caused direct physical harm, pronunciation testing was essentially diagnostic. It identified linguistic background through objective phonetic evidence. Soldiers who passed the test experienced no negative consequences. Those who failed it were identified as potential infiltrators, not through arbitrary discrimination, but through linguistic evidence that they lacked the language background they were claiming. This relatively benign nature, compared to more violent or coercive alternatives, contributed to its acceptability within military operations. However, the broader context of World War II includes elements that complicate simple ethical assessments. The war in the Pacific was marked by intense racial hatred on both sides, with propaganda often depicting the enemy in dehumanizing terms. Japanese forces committed widespread atrocities against prisoners and civilians throughout their conquered territories. Allied forces, particularly as the war progressed and casualties mounted, increasingly treated Japanese prisoners harshly and in some cases committed their own atrocities. In this context, pronunciation testing as a security measure operated within a larger framework that included elements we would now recognize as problematic or worse. The simultaneous internment of Japanese Americans while pronunciation testing was being used at Guadalcanal highlights troubling contradictions. Japanese Americans were stripped of freedom and property based solely on ethnicity and perceived potential disloyalty, despite there being no actual evidence of disloyalty or sabotage. Yet pronunciation testing at Guadalcanal, properly implemented, distinguished linguistic identity rather than ethnic identity, allowing Japanese Americans with native English pronunciation to pass automatically. The test demonstrated that linguistic identity and ethnic identity were not the same thing, a lesson that apparently did not prevent the injustice of internment, but which at least provided operational recognition that American identity could cross ethnic lines. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal, including security procedures like pronunciation testing, informed American operations throughout the rest of the Pacific War. Each subsequent campaign saw improvements in tactics, logistics, and operational coordination as American forces gained experience and adapted their approach. The amphibious assaults that followed, from the bloody struggle at Tarawa through the battles for the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and finally Okinawa, built on the foundation of experience gained at Guadalcanal. While we cannot document pronunciation testing at these later battles with the same certainty as at Guadalcanal, absent similar testimony from participants, the principle of exploiting language differences for security purposes remained sound and likely continued to inform password selection and identification procedures. The scientific understanding of phonology and language acquisition that ultimately explained why pronunciation testing worked came primarily from research conducted after the war, though wartime needs had accelerated some aspects of linguistic research. The Marines at Guadalcanal did not need to understand the theoretical linguistics of phoneme acquisition, neural commitment, or critical periods to recognize that Japanese speakers struggled with English L sounds. They observed this difficulty, whether through interaction with Japanese prisoners, intelligence reports from other theaters, knowledge possessed by Japanese-speaking personnel, or simple trial and error, and they applied the observation to solve an immediate practical problem. This represents the best kind of practical knowledge, observations derived from experience and applied to address pressing needs. The broader implications extend into subsequent conflicts and continuing security applications. During the Vietnam War, American forces faced similar challenges with infiltration and identification, though the linguistic differences between Vietnamese and English provided different phonetic targets for exploitation. In more recent conflicts, linguistic analysis has become increasingly sophisticated, incorporating technologies like voice stress analysis, spectral analysis of speech patterns, and automated dialect identification that extend well beyond simple pronunciation testing. Yet the fundamental principle remains the same, that language characteristics established early in life remain relatively stable and provide objective evidence about linguistic background that can be difficult to fake or disguise. The summer of 1945 brought preparations for what military planners expected would be the final, bloodiest phase of the Pacific War. Plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, anticipated casualties that would dwarf even the enormous losses already sustained. The invasion would place American forces in an environment where enemy infiltration would be even more challenging to detect than on Pacific islands. Japanese forces would operate on home territory with access to unlimited local resources, civilian clothing, and potential support from the civilian population. In this environment, reliable identification procedures would be absolutely essential. Military planners developed comprehensive security protocols for the planned invasion that would have combined pronunciation testing with extensive documentation requirements, physical identification measures, and restricted movement zones. The protocols recognized that even with pronunciation testing, some Japanese individuals with childhood exposure to English or exceptional linguistic training might attempt infiltration. Multiple redundant verification methods would provide defense in depth against sophisticated infiltration attempts. These elaborate plans were never implemented because Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet declaration of war. But the security planning represented the culmination of years of evolution in identification procedures, building on lessons learned from Guadalcanal forward. The post-war declassification of documents related to Pacific War operations has provided historians with extensive material for understanding various aspects of the campaigns. However, specific documentation of pronunciation testing remains surprisingly limited. Beyond Hurlbut's testimony and Gramling's published account, references to the practice are sparse in official records. This absence might reflect several factors. Security procedures that worked effectively often became routine and unremarkable, not warranting detailed discussion in after-action reports that focused on major tactical and operational issues. The informal, tactical-level nature of pronunciation testing, implemented by individual sentries and small unit leaders rather than through formal orders from higher headquarters, might mean that little documentation was generated. The practice might have been more limited in scope than later popular accounts suggest, used consistently at Guadalcanal, but less systematically elsewhere. Whatever the explanation for the limited documentation